Opening the center immediately, this pawn pushes for rapid development and control of key squares. Matching white's central pawn thrust immediately contests the king's pawn territory, aiming for swift development and an open game. Developing the knight immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares to castle, creating a harmonious setup that discourages early pawn grabs. Developing a knight to its most natural square contests central influence and prepares for castling. Opens the Ruy-Lopez, immediately posing a tactical challenge to black's pawn structure and influencing the central pawn majority. Challenging the bishop's placement now forces white to decide the fate of that piece, potentially altering the pawn structure and piece harmony. Retreating the bishop maintains pressure on the pawn chain without immediately provoking confrontation. Black embraces a fianchetto, aiming to build a strong bishop on the long diagonal and prepare kingside castling. Solidifying the center's pawn chain prepares for d4 and gains queenside space. Developing the dark-squared bishop to this diagonal aims to prepare kingside castling and contest the center, but it momentarily neglects pawn defense on the queenside. Safeguarding the monarch becomes paramount as white tucks their king away on the kingside, preparing for future central skirmishes. This maneuver not only increases king's safety, but also connects the rooks, allowing them to coordinate their efforts along open or semi-open files, a crucial element for eventual offensive operations. Solidifying the center and preparing for further development, black anchors the pawn chain while gracefully opening a path for the bishop. Opening the center now to challenge black's pawn structure and seize the initiative, forcing a confrontation that will dictate the game's character. Developing the bishop to d7 solidifies black's queenside pawn structure and prepares for potential queenside castling or supporting a d5 push, offering a flexible and solidifying response. Anchoring the bishop here solidifies the center and prepares to challenge black's d6 pawn, aiming to gain a foothold in the heart of the board and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. Developing the knight to f6 aims to contest the center and prepare for castling, a logical step in solidifying the kingside. This move simultaneously challenges white's piece on f3, potentially forcing a decision about its placement or opening avenues for counterplay along the central files. It's a natural developing sequence that sets the stage for further maneuvering and skirmishes in the early middle game. Securing the king's protection and preparing for a central pawn advance, the knight reroutes to a more flexible square, eyeing potential queenside expansion and bolstering the central structure without overextending. Fortifying the king's sanctuary with this castling, black prioritizes immediate defensive solidity, bringing the king to safety behind a pawn wall while preparing to connect the rooks for future central influence. Securing the kingside pawn structure prevents potential bishop invasions or knight outposts on g4, subtly reinforcing the defender's monarch against any immediate kingside thrusts. Introducing the rook to the e-file, this maneuver prepares for potential action along that open path, while also safeguarding the king and potentially supporting a future pawn push. It's a subtle yet important piece of defensive coordination, ensuring all elements are ready for the unfolding strategic battle. The bishop retreats, clearing the diagonal for the queen and maintaining its influence on the long b1h7 diagonal, while simultaneously defending against any immediate knight incursions towards the queenside. Unifying the rooks behind the pawn wall while preparing for a potential h5 advance, this queen redeployment cleverly clears the path for the kingside bishop and aims to consolidate black's defensive structure. Recentering the rook to the central file after the initial skirmish on the queenside creates a dynamic hub for future operations. This repositioning not only prepares for potential pawn pushes like d5, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain, but also frees up the f1 bishop for more active deployment, potentially targeting the kingside. The knight on d2 now finds itself better supported, and the entire white formation gains a touch more flexibility, a crucial element when the center is somewhat locked. It's a move that signals a shift from territorial skirmishes to more direct central engagement, hinting at a patient buildup of pressure. Pivoting the queen to f8 suddenly reveals a subtle yet significant shift in black's aspirations, moving away from the central e-file skirmishes and hinting at a more robust kingside defense or a potential rerouting towards the h-file. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, skillfully avoids any immediate tactical pitfalls and repositions the queen to a less exposed square, allowing other pieces to find more active posts without the queen being a prime target. Opening up lines with this exchange immediately shifts the strategic landscape, forcing a re-evaluation of piece placement and pawn structure as the queenside now possesses greater access. Reclaiming the central pawn immediately addresses the captured piece, reintegrating a key attacker into the battle for the liberated d-file and potentially opening lines for your queen. Liberating the knight from its previous pawn blockade, this exchange simplifies the central struggle and clears the d-file, potentially opening avenues for the rook later. White opts for a trade that slightly eases the pressure on the e4 pawn and prepares for more dynamic central play, perhaps aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's king. Reclaiming the center with the rook reestablishes a crucial pawn presence, creating a more dynamic pawn structure and potentially opening lines for future piece activity. Unleashing the queen's influence, white aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain and exploit the slightly exposed king. This bold central deployment signifies an immediate intention to engage, creating complex tactical possibilities and forcing black to assess the safety of their monarch and the integrity of their queenside structure. The knight's repositioning back to its starting square subtly reinforces the pawn structure and prepares for potential kingside activity, a rather passive but solid decision aimed at maintaining a balanced position after white's aggressive pawn push. Gaining a slight edge in control of the d-file, this bishop placement aims to exert pressure on black's queenside and potentially disrupt their pawn structure if black decides to push the b-pawn. It also prepares for a potential knight repositioning to f4 or g5 in some scenarios, adding further attacking possibilities. Exploring the queenside, black seeks to relocate his knight from the passive central square, aiming for more active influence and potentially preparing a kingside push or a regrouping maneuver to support his queenside structure. Shifting the bishop to b3 redirects pressure along the a4 e8 diagonal, subtly preparing for a potential pawn push on the queenside or a regrouping of pieces that could enhance kingside attacking prospects later. Dismantling the pawn chain around the king creates immediate weaknesses, particularly for the g6 pawn, and opens up the h-file for potential future action, yet it might also invite further pressure on that side of the board. Shifting the bishop to e3 aims to both defend the knight on d2 and potentially prepare a kingside pawn storm, while also giving up the strong diagonal that was pointing towards black's castled king on g7. Black finally brings the bishop into the fray, looking to untangle its pieces and potentially contest the d-file should it open. But this maneuver also frees up the queen to potentially reposition or support a future pawn advance on the queen side. A subtle repositioning, the bishop abandons the potentially awkward diagonal, seeking greater influence and preparing to support a central pawn push or redeploy to a more active square on the king side. Opening the d-file for its rook signals black's intention to create immediate pressure on the d-file, potentially leading to an exchange sacrifice or forcing white to defend with precise piece placement. Repositioning the knight to a more active square aims to challenge black's central grip and potentially exploit the weakness on f6. Black's queen is rerouting, seeking a more dynamic presence on the e7 square, which now opens up the f8 rook for potential central activity. Finally establishing a strong presence on the d-file, white is aiming to create sustained pressure and potentially unravel black's somewhat passive setup. A bold attempt to disrupt white's cozy setup and challenge the central pawn structure, though it risks overextension and leaves the king's flank exposed. Re-establishing bishop pressure on the a7-g2 diagonal after black's knight retreat signifies a desire to regain initiative and prevent black from comfortably organizing their pieces. Reclaiming central space and preparing for potential pawn breaks, the black queen repositions, hinting at an offensive maneuver while maintaining defensive integrity against the bishop's watchful eye. Simplifying the material to enter a potentially favorable endgame, by clearing the central tension. The knight's repositioning to f6, while seemingly passive, skillfully navigates the recent exchange of queens and sets the stage for a more dynamic middle game, aiming to leverage the open e-file. Anchoring the knight's retreat and preparing a potential kingside pawn advance, this move solidifies white's structure, creating a safer haven for the king and potentially initiating a slow positional squeeze by restricting black's pieces. Pioneering a pawn thrust into the enemy's central stronghold, black initiates a dynamic positional struggle, aiming to fracture white's well-entrenched pawn structure and awaken dormant pieces from their quiescent positions. This pawn thrust decisively injects dynamism into the central structure, challenging black's pawn chain and potentially opening avenues for white's pieces. Initiating a pawn thrust to challenge white's central control, black aims to pry open lines for their pieces, specifically targeting the d5 square as a potential outpost for the knight. This injection of activity seeks to disrupt white's currently solid pawn chain and create dynamic imbalances. Fortifying the central pawn chain, f4* aims to solidify white's pawn structure and create a potential stronghold for the knight on f3, while also restricting black's knight mobility on d7 and preparing for potential kingside advances should the opportunity arise. Striking back at the pawn center, black ignites a pawn thrust intended to disrupt white's central blockade and free up the knight on f6. Liberating the bishop from its passive defensive post, this capture injects immediate dynamism into the central theater. By sacrificing the pawn, white seeks to unravel black's pawn chain and create dynamic play on the open d-file. The ensuing position, though material equal, is rife with tactical possibilities as both sides vie for control of key squares and consider pawn breaks. Watch closely how black's king might become a target if coordination falters. Opening up lines for the bishop on g7 is a bold decision, sacrificing a pawn to potentially activate your pieces and challenge white's central control after this capture. Snatching the pawn now, while seemingly aggressive, abandons the opportunity to consolidate control over the d-file and potentially squeeze black's position further. This might open avenues for black's pieces to become more active sooner than intended, as their king's safety feels more assured with white's queen and bishop now committed to capturing material. Grappling with the newly opened b-file, black's rook instantly occupies it, creating immediate counterplay and threatening to disrupt white's coordination. This proactive stance challenges white's queen and bishop development on the queen side, forcing a defensive consideration rather than allowing white to dictate the entire rhythm of the game. Securing the advanced passed pawn's safety becomes paramount as the bishop relocates, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the queen side. Reclaiming the rook from the open file allows it to potentially redeploy to a more active square, perhaps the third rank where it could support a pawn push or pressure white's weakened structure. Capturing the bishop dramatically simplifies the position, aiming to exploit black's isolated pawn structure and the open d-file. Reclaiming that pawn is the most logical step, immediately contesting the open c-file that white's bishop has briefly held captive and setting up potential pressure against the d3 pawn if white isn't careful with piece placement. Clearing the path to the 7th rank becomes paramount now, as your rook asserts dominance over the open file, forcing a decisive exchange and simplifying into a potentially advantageous endgame. Reclaiming the attacked bishop immediately is paramount, otherwise losing the piece would be disastrous. A subtle step to solidify your pawn structure and potentially prepare a queenside pawn push. This maneuver also aims to protect your bishop from further harassment and create a safe haven for your king if the center opens up, while simultaneously preventing black's rooks from gaining further activity on the central files. The rook's retreat to the 8th rank, while seemingly passive, is a subtle bid to contest the open d-file and disrupt white's central pawn structure, aiming to create counterplay where none readily exists. The pawn advances to c4, aiming to solidify the queenside and potentially prepare a central pawn push, seeking to gain space and restrict black's pieces, particularly the rook currently on e8. Capturing the pawn opens the e-file, potentially creating attacking avenues for white's rook and queen on that open column. while simultaneously simplifying the position towards an endgame where white's pawn majority on the kingside might become a significant factor. Reclaiming the initiative on the queenside, this bishop repositions to a more active square, eyeing the weakened c5 pawn and preparing to support a pawn push on the queenside, aiming to restrict black's pieces and potentially create a passed pawn. The exchange of rooks on the e-file simplifies the position considerably, preparing for a potential endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the queenside may become a factor, but black needs to carefully consider their piece activity and pawn structure. With the king's pawn endgame now a certainty, the recapture of the bishop solidifies black's material advantage and brings white closer to a lost position, as their remaining pieces struggle to coordinate effectively against the isolated pawns. Shifting the monarch towards the center isn't just a necessity in this sparse position. It's a proactive step to activate a dormant piece and prepare for potential opposition activity, anticipating the rook's eventual penetration along the open file. Opening up the queenside and preparing to activate the queen for counterplay against black's somewhat passive structure. The bishop now aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially forcing a concession or creating pathways for black's remaining pieces. Securing the monarch from immediate threats, this king repositioning anticipates potential future checks and aims to create a more robust defensive setup behind the pawn shield. Unleashing a pawn thrust to disrupt the bishop's diagonal dominance, black attempts to wrest some initiative. Unlocking the d-file for the queen's rook and bringing the knight into a more active central role, this maneuver prepares for potential breakthroughs and central pawn pushes. This maneuver aims to activate the rook on the open c-file and challenge white's control of the 7th rank, potentially preparing to push the passed pawn on the queenside. Gaining central space with the knight redirects pressure towards black's king, while challenging the pawn chain's integrity. Bringing the bishop back to its active square, this maneuver aims to shore up the kingside while simultaneously preparing to challenge white's centralized knight. Boldly venturing the bishop to the queenside aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses, but it also exposes the bishop to counterplay and could be a strategic overextension if black can consolidate. The knight's repositioning offers a more active role, aiming to contest the central squares and potentially penetrate black's weakened kingside pawn structure, while also preparing for a possible advance of the f-pawn to further restrict white's pieces. Seeking to extricate the king from the potential danger zone and prepare for a more active role in the impending pawn endgame, white repositions. A bold but potentially premature embrace of activity for the king, thrusting it into the fray amidst unresolved tension, rather than consolidating his pieces behind the pawn shield. The knight launches a daring sortie, creating an immediate fork that disrupts black's centralizing pawn structure and aims to exploit the now exposed king. The king boldly steps into the fray, seeking an active role in this endgame, though it leaves him exposed to potential checks and king hunts along the open files, forcing a close watch on white's knight maneuvers and the placement of the bishop on the long diagonal. Returning the knight to f3 repositions it, aiming to control the critical e5 square and potentially prepare for further maneuvering, while also defending the g5 outpost that was briefly under pressure. The pawn push on the kingside aims to establish greater space for black's pieces, particularly the knight currently on f6, potentially freeing it for more active squares, though it does weaken the kingside pawn structure slightly. A subtle repositioning of the knight, aiming to achieve better protection for the king and potentially exploit the weakened kingside structure that black has allowed. Seeking a breakthrough, black initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, attempting to create weaknesses around white's monarch, though the potential for overextension remains a serious consideration. Instantly, the bishop repositions, aiming to control the crucial c-file and menace black's pawns. The black king, suddenly exposed and lacking pawn protection, begins a desperate dash for the queenside, hoping to find refuge and perhaps activate itself as a fighting piece in the unfolding endgame. Unlocking the diagonal for the bishop on c7 suddenly transforms the board's landscape. Unleashing the g-pawn's potential, This advance initiates a daring pawn storm, aiming to pry open white's king defenses and inject dynamic play into a somewhat static position. Clearing a path for the knight to participate actively, this capture immediately opens the king's defense. The pawn's advance here seizes control of a key square, threatening to break open lines around white's king and potentially create a passed pawn of its own. This aggressive posture aims to disrupt white's pieces, which are currently well placed but somewhat static, forcing them to react to black's initiative. Harnessing the knight's latent power, white repositions it from the wing to the central battleground, aiming to activate its dormant potential and challenge black's kingside pawns. Finally, black redirects their bishop, aiming to solidify its presence on the f2 square and potentially offer support for the advancing g-pawn. This maneuver seeks to leverage the bishop's newfound central influence, contrasting with white's bishop's more passive placement on a5, a location that feels somewhat isolated and lacking in immediate attacking prospects. Shifting the monarch to the second rank offers a crucial sanctuary, disentangling the king from potential checks along the 8th rank and clearing the way for the knight to potentially access more active squares. Unleashing a desperate pawn thrust to stir up the king's surroundings, this gambit aims to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially create shelter for black's monarch amidst the ongoing exchange of material. A king venturing so far forward risks becoming a delightful target. Tuck him away swiftly before those knights get too cozy in the central ranks. The black monarch, now exposed on the kingside, attempts to find refuge, but its journey to safety is fraught with peril given the centralization of white's knight and the open lines threatening its current position. A decisive forcing sequence begins with the king, aiming to expose the black monarch's precarious shelter and create immediate threats. The black monarch, having recently escaped the central danger zone, now seeks refuge on the kingside, a crucial decision as the opposition looks to exploit the open files and weakened pawn structure. Sacrificing the knight now forces the black king into a deadly mating net, a brilliant tactical geometry that prioritizes eliminating the last defender. The exposed black king now faces an unavoidable cascade of checks after this pawn capture, forcing a premature endgame where material advantage will prove decisive. Securing the central pawns after the exchange, this piece repositions to dominate the critical dark squares, a subtle but significant step in orchestrating the final stages of this complex endgame. The pawn's advance, coupled with the bishop's sacrifice and the knight's sacrifice, created an inescapable mating net, a beautiful demonstration of coordinated attack where every piece played its crucial role in boxing in the enemy king.